I have a treat for you with this episode. We are talking to the wealth of knowledge, the powerhouse, Dr. Stacy Sims. She is on a mission to share that women are not just smaller versions of men. When it comes to exercise, nutrition, and medicine, it's long been assumed that it's just that way, that women's bodies are too complex to study, and so let's just look at men as the baseline. But how crazy is that when women are 50% of the population? So we've got all this deficiency in science-based information around women's bodies and how to train, how to exercise, eating foods, and all of this that is holding us back as women from reaching our full potential. We don't even know what we're truly capable of as women and our highest potential because the research hasn't yet gathered with enough momentum and enough abundance of studies to really support that. There are still so many questions. But in this episode, we are going to explore what we do know about working with women's bodies, fluctuating hormone levels. We touch on perimenopause, menopause in quite a lot of detail, as well as the menstrual cycle. So no matter what stage of life you're at, there is something in this episode that you will walk away with your jaw dropped. I certainly know I did. Stacy taught me so much in this episode too, especially if you've ever been curious about the nitty-gritty of how to move your body and why we want to favor certain kinds of exercise over others to really get the best results. Because at the end of the day, we have so much potential for calming our nervous system through movement and exercise. And it is something that can really support our health, our longevity, so that when we're in our 80s, our 90s, we can be mobile and feeling good and really milking this amazing life that we're living. Okay, let's go to the show. Welcome to the show. It is such a pleasure to have you joining us with your breadth of wisdom on the topic of working with our physiology as women. I'm so curious to ask you where this all started for you in your journey of, working and understanding your own body as a woman.
Gosh, so many years ago when I was in undergrad, university, that inquisitive mind of wanting to be a scientist and doing experiments in class and being like one of the only women that would volunteer to run on a treadmill for 2 hours with no water or anything. And it's so kind of crazy experiments. And it got to a point where they would throw my results out saying that I didn't do the standardization right. There was something wrong. My results were anomaly. And I was like, wait a second. I'm the daughter of a colonel in the army. I'm pretty sure I know how to follow directions and did standardization right. And then the more I started digging, the more I realized is because women's data isn't the norm. Like all the norm falls into pretty much the cis male or the college age 18 to 22-year-old male. And if it's anything outside of that, they would say it was an anomaly, wouldn't include it. And being a competitive athlete and also being competitive by nature of asking why, I really got to be in my bonnet to understand why we were being excluded in such important metrics. We know on the outside, you go to like a farmer's or some other department store, and you have the women's section and the men's section. And in social constructs, you have male and female. But when it comes to really important things, like how we train, how we eat, how we sleep, what are these metrics? How do we track these metrics to improve our health? They just combine the sexes and make women oh, you're the same as men. So we all default to the male model. And so that has kind of been the crust of everything I've been trying to unpack through my academic and other aspects of my career.
And that is something that I find so inspiring. And I love your mission, which is all about women are not just smaller men.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And you want to shout that from the rooftops. Tell me, what's that about? Women are not just smaller men.
It was a kind of a catchphrase I would use when I was teaching undergrads, when I was doing my postdoc at Stanford. And I'd have to teach a training and principles class after lunch. And so everyone would be kind of tired and sleepy. And so I'd always pretty much start a lecture with women are not small men and it would wake them up. Like the guys would be like, what are you talking about? And the girls would be like, yeah, you're right. We are different. So then it just kind of became the catchphrase for a lot of the things that we're going through and a lot of the things that I've been trying to push. And I launched a product into the sport nutrition world, and that was their tagline on our bottle: women are not small men, we need to do things differently. So it's catchy, and it really attracts people's attention to ask, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean women are not small men?
Yeah, yeah. And this concept of women being excluded from medical and health data, or being kind of ignored to some degree because our bodies are too complex, is something that, goes across a widespread number of conditions and parts of understanding our human bodies and how they work. Um, can you explain a little more for our listeners why that is? I know you mentioned some, like, it's not the norm, but what is it about women's bodies that makes them so inherently complex?
It's a combination, really, of the cultural nuances and how science and medicine kind of evolved, as well as the misunderstanding of sex differences from birth all the way through epigenetic changes that happen with the menstrual cycle. So we think about the cultural context of how medicine started. If we think before the actual, what's the word I'm looking for? Making it a proper profession. So back in the days of the healers, and there wasn't actually medicine, we looked to women who were the caregivers, the healers, the supposed witches of the tribes and that kind of stuff. But as things became more standardized and men were really starting to become thought leaders, supposedly within society, like, you don't know anything, you belong in the house. We men are the ones that are going to, because we have bigger brains, we understand things better. So the mind switch became, oh, men know things. Men are the default. Men can withstand the pain of these scientific experiments. When we're looking to do a scientific design, we're looking at doing a washouts. We have 1 week on, 1 week off, and then 1 week on. But when we look at female physiology, it doesn't work that way. So it was never really in the mind of early medicine, and even to like the 1980s, to even include female rats, female participants, women in RCTs. It was just 2021 where I think it was 42% of randomized controlled trials actually included men and women. And that's just, 2 years ago. So we still have a lot to come up. But when we start really looking at things like medicine, and we know the Ambien story where they're overdosing women based on results of trials from men, and we look at cardiovascular issues where, when we're looking at things like wearables and heart rate variability, it doesn't take into account that a woman's normal resting pattern has a longer interval between heartbeats than men. So an algorithm misreads that and then gives us a different heart rate variability based on male algorithms. So it's still endemic, and we're trying to unpack it, but it's still so much the norm of looking through the male lens and using the cis male as the default from algorithms and AI. And it's pretty much who's in the room having these conversations. And if you think about high tech, who's in the room having these conversations? So I think that's where, like, the push for femtech is coming in, where we're having women having the conversations. We're looking at female metrics. How are we closing that gender data gap? But it's really only 3% of the market. So again, we still have a long way to go.
Okay, that is fascinating. I have so many questions for you. First one is, did you say they didn't do studies using female rats either? Rats?
No,
Like,
no. No, it wasn't. Like, it's still the default that most medical, like in the lab, molecular studies are done on male cells. And they didn't use female rats because of estrus, the menstrual cycle. So again, a lot of the stuff that we know is based on male rat data, male rodent data, human men, and even early studies on bone mineral density and osteopenia and the risk factors were done on old men. And they're like, hey, wait, now women have a higher risk factor. We look at aspirin for cardiovascular risk factors, and they're saying, hey, yeah, you should take aspirin to reduce coagulation. All of that data is from men, and we know women have a different response to aspirin. So it's so ingrained in a lot of the guidelines and recommendations that are given. When you start to unpack it, you're like, hold on, the Medical Society doesn't know anything about women.
Yeah.
Except for breast cancer.
Right. Yes, because that's specific to the breast, and you can't study those in men so much.
Right. Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, so just to put this into some context for someone listening, if I had like an Oura ring or one of those monitoring devices, because the defaults are set to data from men, does that mean it's like not really accurate for me as a woman?
We want to look at your trends, your overall trends. So when we're looking at sleep architecture, we're looking at heart rate variability, we know that sleep architecture changes across the menstrual cycle because of the way estrogen, progesterone affect our neurotransmitters. And it's there, and you see it in Aura data, you see it in Whoop data. Does that mean we have to change things? We don't know because no one's really studied. It's just different than what a man has. So they say, well, you're not sleeping well. Your architecture is not correct to have a really good restful recovery sleep. And that again is comparing to what the norm is for men. Do we know if, changing the architecture of our sleep is bad? Well, if you think from a biological standpoint, women are still here and we outlive men, and sleep is so important. So why is the default saying, oh, you're not as well recovered, you're not as well rested? And we see that also like with heart rate variability. And we see there's an inherent change from ovulation to the first day of your next period. So in the high hormone phase, your heart rate variability significantly drops. So it looks like you're not very resilient to stress. From a physiological perspective, probably you're not. Your immune system changes as well. But what if we were to compare luteal phase or high hormone phase to high hormone phase instead of luteal phase to follicular phase or low hormone phase? Because all the algorithms right now are just comparing across the month or day to day, but they're not looking phase to phase. So to get a really good insight on, are you recovering well? Are you invoking more parasympathetic responses? We need to do phase-to-phase comparison with regards to high hormone and low hormone to low hormone, because there's always going to be a difference between low and high.
What a brilliant question to be asking and a way to be looking at it. It's just mind-boggling that there's so many like shrugging shoulders in the research community about women. It's just like, I don't know, like
Yeah.
you're too complicated. Instead of
Yeah.
actually figuring out a system of how we can better support women. And some of the work I do, Stacey, is with the mind and the way our thoughts are impacting our bodies. So I wonder how many women are looking at, let's say you are measuring things with a Fitbit or, one of those devices, and you're looking at your sleep every day thinking, or at least for a few days of a month going, oh no, I've slept so badly. This is so bad
Exactly.
for me.
Exactly. When I give lectures on this, there are so many women who leave feeling empowered. And then I'll get emails saying, I've gotten rid of that negative self talk because now I understand it's not my fitness, it's not my sleep habits, it's my physiology. So now I'm starting to track the trend instead of day to day. I want to see month to month. I want to see what's happening phase to phase. And when people have that data and understand it and then can get the bigger picture, it gives them a sense of relief and it gives them an empowerment to make actual changes that will impact them in a positive manner instead of dwelling on, oh, I didn't reach the norm, because we know the norm isn't a female norm, it's a cis male norm.
That is so beautiful to hear, because so many people listening to this do really relate to being a perfectionist, and perfectionism on the health level. I mean, I've been there too. I was orthorexic. I was like living by these strict food rules, and I failed the day if I've like gone off that slightly one day, when really we know that real health and well-being comes from consistency over time. And if you
Yeah.
have one day where you rest and don't work out and maybe you're hungover, like it's not going to ruin your whole life. Like your health is not going to just dissolve into a wormhole.
No, that one day you'll feel like crap, but then the rest of it, it's the 80-20 rule that is so hard for perfectionists. And I say I'm an A minus because I've been working on that whole perfection thing, right?
Yeah.
The 80-20 rule, 80% you're in that, like on it. And then the 20% is life factor. And you can't dwell on that 20%. It's life and it's fun. Because
Yes.
if we go through with all these strict rules we put around us and we have this negative self-talk around us all the time, we go through life in a gray blur instead of actually enjoying it.
Exactly, which is where so much, pleasure and joy and fulfillment comes from. And if we're not getting enough of that, hey, we can feel even more anxious, which isn't
Yeah.
so great. I'm finding this so fascinating, Stacey, because you could go into this topic, and I'm curious if you ever do get criticism or backlash. What am I trying to say? Backlash.
Backlash. Backlash.
Backlash. Thank you. Backlash from other, from feminists or something, because well, we're all feminists, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to say that we're all equal to men. There's this idea, right, that you're pretty much saying we're not equal to men physiologically, and we've got to look at those differences and honor them. But for some of us, I mean, yeah, there's that sense of like, hang on, like, aren't we meant to be saying that we're all equal?
Yeah, but I don't want to be equal to men because I know that we haven't reached our performance potential. We don't know what that actually is. There's so much more ground that women can make. We can supersede what that norm is for men. It's just that we haven't had the opportunity to. So as much as we fight to have like closing the gender data gap, closing that pay gap and everything, yes, those are really strong things. But from a physiological perspective, the human body isn't an algorithm, for one thing. So when people start disseminating it down, it's like, okay, we're getting into that whole like male view of an algorithm, but we actually do not know what is the performance potential of women because we have not looked at physiology. We have been training them according to male protocols. We've been testing according to male protocols. We've been using nutrition and overtraining metrics, all of these things, all of these protocols that go into fitness and health and well-being all still exist from male protocols. And if we really start pushing the envelope and saying, hey, wait, we are not small men, we deserve better than this. And we start looking at hormone fluctuations and epigenetic changes that occur through our different life phases from puberty all the way to menopause. And if we're using any kind of hormonal contraception, we understand that, then we can improve our potential and actually supersede what those norms and expectations are.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so inspiring. And I think that, anyone like challenged with that topic, I mean, you just have to zoom out a little bit further and say women, equality is women in healthcare and well-being and research in this area receiving the same amount of attention and detail and volume of data that men have received. And
exactly,
it's like way, way deficient in that.
Yes.
So you are quite hopeful that there is more for women and how our bodies can function if we understood them better.
Yes. And I've been pushing this message for, I don't want to say it, but I will, decades. And it's just in the past about 4 or 5 years that we've seen this global uptick of the conversations around periods and menstrual cycles, and now perimenopause and menopause, and reducing the tabooness around it. Yeah. So not only is it coming into like the general population conversation, it's eked into scientific literature and scientific conversations. So now we're seeing more and more methodological papers being published. We're seeing peer-reviewed rejections because the data isn't designed to include women. And there's a statement, we did not include women because of the menstrual cycle. That's unacceptable now. So now we're seeing this push in the scientific community to include female rats, include female cells, really look at the sex differences, look at including women in randomized controlled trials, the same equality as we are including in men. From the medical perspective, again, to close that gender gap in the data, but really understand the mechanics to specific female physiology. So if we're getting that push in the scientific world, and then it's also feeding out into the general pop, it's just this cascade. I think we're starting to reach that tipping point where it's going to supersede. And now we're going to see so much more really good, robust data coming out for women.
That is so exciting. And I mean, I can only imagine the ramifications of women having been so excluded because of the menstrual cycle. It's this recurring theme through history, like the menstrual cycle is our downfall. It's a negative, it's a burden, it's messy, it's disgusting. And I have women say that to me even as recently as last week, that, there's something disgusting about the bleed and this whole process that our bodies go through. And the fact, just like one influence of that would be that it's just like, oh, it's inconvenient for science.
Yeah, I know. And And the way we look at it as a big picture is if we didn't have menstrual cycles, none of us would be here, because the whole thing is reproduction, right? You have a menstrual cycle because it's a reproductive function. And if science started from a female lens, it would not be an issue whatsoever. It would be included in scientific design. It would be an open conversation. It wouldn't be messy and inconvenient. It would be, there's small pockets that are like, yes, I got my period. And so it would be celebrated. But because we've had this cultural context and this cultural influence that it is it's taboo, you're a delicate flower, you need to be in a menstrual hut, all these negative things that still are pervasive through younger generation and older generation. It's just the middle that's starting to, come up in the conversations. So I'm not surprised that that still exists, but like my whole ethos has been, let's change that. Let's make that a powerful thing. We are looking at the period as being an ergogenic aid. We know that the hormones have dropped. We're more resilient to stress. We have better mojo. We're stronger. We have the capability of hitting higher intensities, having less sleep. All of these things that are supposedly, positives for men, we have inherently just when we start bleeding.
Yeah. Yes. And yeah, just understanding that really it's not a new thing even to see the menstrual cycle as sacred and something to honor. That was how it was until sort of patriarchal themes came through.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it's a remembering of what humanity always knew, which was that this is the creation of life and it is magical and amazing and something to revere.
Yes. And then we get to the other end where people are hardly talking about menopause. It's starting to come out. But in other cultures, not the Western culture, but other cultures, it's revered as well. Because now it's like, oh, I've passed through that. I don't have to worry about having a child that I'm too old to really take care of, but I can take care of my grandchildren. I'm the wise one where people come for information. So it's like another, I guess, stepping stone and another like milestone to cross into that women should be revered for. So again, it's that patriarchal conversation, and you even see it in images where women are, once they pass 40, they're quote old in Hollywood, right? But men get older and older and older because we see these images. So again, it's another push to change that conversation, to say it is a natural part of aging and it's a good thing, because now you have this freedom to be expressive, you have this freedom to share your wisdom, and you have the freedom from potentially getting pregnant if that's not what you wanted to do.
Yes, I mean, this is a total tangent, but I actually about a year ago posted a photo of an older man and an older woman, and I said, like, is it true that older men are the only ones that are attractive and like women are not attractive when they're older? And so many people voted for older men and more like men age better than women. And gosh, like that is purely our perception.
Yes, it is. Because if you walk around, you're like, really? You see lots of older men and they are not Hollywood ideal, right? We saw this older couple today when we were out doing errands, and they were walking along, and she had like her little Zimmer frame. He had his little Zimmer frame. And I turned to my husband. I'm like, is that going to be us? He goes, yeah, except we'll be racing. So it's not the perception of one's going to be better than the other. It's just like, hey, they're both aging, they're both together, and they both get to do these things together. So yeah, it is that perception. It's a frustrating perception.
I'm curious, going back to the menopause idea that we were speaking about, do you ever wonder how much shame has skewed the data and what we understand about menopause, or not speaking up about it, not talking about the experience because we don't want to cause a fuss, because we don't want to say, I'm actually struggling?
Yes. And when we look historically again at what and the menopausal symptoms, we understand now that most of the witches that were burned at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts, were actually women who were going through perimenopause because of hot flashes and mood changes and all the symptomology that we now know is menopause symptoms, but they were not understood. Like, it was, women weren't bleeding, then they were bleeding heavily. When they got hot flashes, the devil has them, and they were trying all sorts of different remedies to get through this. So then they were burned at the stake because they were a witch. We also know that even further in the early 19th century, when they were looking at women who were perimenopause and going through hot flashes and mood shit, they were put in insane asylums and given frontal lobotomies because they were, quote, going insane. So it's all of these negative things. So it's no wonder that women kept it hush hush if the results was death or being incarcerated just because your body was going through these changes. So now as we get into 2023 and we're starting to have conversations about how menopause affects brain function, work function, and how it affects women in the middle of their career when they should be stepping up. Now big companies are like, hey, we need to do something because we can't afford to lose the talent that these women have. So it is a small change in conversation. And so that's why it's starting to come out of the woodwork, because now you're having bigger corporations who are like, we need to support women because they're so important to our upper management. They're important for the way the company runs, and we don't want to lose these women.
And if we are supported, we can function possibly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Possibly better than men.
Yeah, exactly.
Not that it's a men versus women discussion.
No.
But gosh, I mean, this is why we need to shift the dialogue around for me, witch is such a empowering, exciting word as well, because to reclaim that in a positive sense feels very, very powerful. I don't know why it's just like taking away this idea of like, you're a witch and that being a bad thing. I'm like, the witches were like the badass women, like leading the way for so many of us.
Yeah, I know. They were the trailblazers, and then they were deemed as being evil because the men didn't understand them because they couldn't keep up.
Exactly. Okay, so talking a little bit about exercise and how we can utilize this. Let's just start with menopause, seeing as we're here already, and then we might go back to the menstrual cycle in general. But are there specific ways of moving our body that are going to be more beneficial for us if we're moving through that perimenopausal or menopausal transition?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want people to understand is that recommendation of 150 minutes of moderate vigorous activity per week is absolutely wrong for women who are going through this stage. Yay. And the reason for that, I know, the reason for that is it puts women squarely in the moderate intensity zone. And this is the zone where you're maybe 70, 75% of your maximum heart rate. It increases cortisol, it increases sympathetic drive, it increases lean mass breakdown. It doesn't create a physiological stress that will create positive adaptations. So when we look at women's physiology, we are already inherently able to burn fatty acids. Our muscles and our muscle perfusion, our muscle fiber types, they're all geared for going long and slow and being very fatigue resistant. What we start to lose when we lose estrogen and progesterone is we lose power and strength. We lose speed. We lose our ability to build lean mass. So we have to look externally at what kind of exercise stress can we put on our body to create a response that doesn't require those hormones. So when we look at things like resistance training, it is becoming the be all end all with regards to exercise. Like we know that it increases neural growth factors, so helps prevent Alzheimer's and dementia. We see that it increases the responses from our central nervous system, so it helps with balance and proprioception. And then when we bring it specific to women, we look and see that estrogen is really tightly tied to what we call the satellite cell or the basal cell of the muscle contraction, and how fast the nerve innervates the muscle. So when we lose estrogen, then we're losing the stimulus to build lean mass. We're losing the stimulus for speed and power and a strong muscle contraction. But if we lift heavy and we lift heavier loads as we go, we're creating complete central nervous system response where the nerve is like, oh my gosh, I have to have enough acetylcholine to cross this gap junction, which usually was because estrogen was there to stimulate it. But now the central nervous system is saying it to be able to recruit a whole bunch of muscle fibers to contract really strongly to lift this load. And without estrogen, that's what we need. With estrogen used to do that for us. But when you don't have it, we want that central nervous system response. So we look at resistance training. It's not the 8 to 15 reps. It's not body weight exercise. It's actually getting in there and lifting heavy loads where we're looking at 0 to 6 reps. We're doing 5 sets. And you're not like trying to superset it with ab work or any cardiovascular work. You're going in, it's a central nervous system loading, and you're lifting it to build muscle, to build power, to build speed, and for brain health. When we look from a cardiovascular standpoint, We want to polarize our training. So we want that top end of high intensity work where we're doing 85 to 90% for our work interval, or even better yet, sprint interval training, which is supramaximal. So it's up to 30 seconds, 110%. You're going full gas, because both of those will induce an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory response after you finish, and a growth hormone response and a boost of testosterone. They also increase our ability to have better glucose control. So we know that women going through perimenopause get a little bit more insulin resistant. If we're doing that top end intensity, it causes a change and an epigenetic change within the muscle, which allows our muscles to pull in carbohydrate without insulin. So there's all these things that we need to think about as we're going through perimenopause and postmenopause. We know that it's a dose response, and the closer to menopause that you change up and do high resistance training or heavy resistance training and high intensity work, the better we have with cardiovascular outcomes, metabolic outcomes. We have better lean mass development. We have better outcomes for preventing osteoporosis. And again, the strong one there is brain health. Both cardiovascular and resistance training are essential for brain health. So all of the fears that we have with menopause, right? We're going to get fat. We're going to put on visceral, the deep abdominal fat. We're going to lose our lean mass. We're becoming insulin resistant. We're going to lose our bones. We're going to lose our minds. We can counter that by looking at changing our training. And then for those women who do need it, you can look at menopause hormone therapy, knowing that it's a therapy to help support, but it's not the be all end all. Because now we hear all of these things of, oh, every woman should be on hormones, but it's not that. It's let's look at exercise. Let's change exercise. Let's match our nutrition in those changes. And then if we're still having major issues that are compounding in our daily life, we can ask and really get into the other conversation about menopause hormone therapy.
What's really interesting about this too, and what you've just explained is like the ideal for a woman going through that transition in life, is that I think culturally there's some kind of, it's not normal to see women in their 50s or maybe late 40s going through doing lots of weight training, lifting like the really heavy weights or sprinting typically.
Right.
And this might just be my cultural perception, but typically it's like, I'm going to go to Pilates. I'm going to do a walk around the lake with my friend. And that's the exercise norm as a cultural sense, I would say.
Yes, exactly. And so now we're like really trying to push and go, the more research that comes out on menopause, and the more we see the effect of resistance training, and the more effects we see on high intensity work, it should be a prescription that every physician puts out for their peri and postmenopausal women. My PhD student who defended last week, her specific topic was looking at high intensity interval training for early postmenopausal women versus late postmenopausal women. Early postmenopausal women had these fantastic cardiovascular adaptations when they were doing high intensity work and forgetting about that 150-minute, walking stuff. And they played floorball hockey because they're Danish. And then they did some high intensity work on the spin bikes on alternate days. That's what they did. So all in all, they had 4 sessions a week that were maybe 40 minutes. And that was with warm up and cool down. So lots of high intensity specific work. And at the end, they had much better vascular compliance. So all these women were afraid of the cardiovascular changes, but it was as if they were premenopausal again. So that is the kind of stuff that's now being investigated, now needs to be translated out, that we need this high intensity work. Forget about the aesthetics, that comes later, but for just general health and to be able to have a long quality of health as we get older, we need to look at that high intensity work. And we also need to look at that resistance training.
So that when we're in our 80s and 90s, we're racing along instead of like hobbling over our Zimmer frame.
Exactly. When we're 105, we can use the Zimmer frame races, but up to that point, we need to like really look at our own muscle work.
And that study you just referenced with the Danish women, it sounds like they were predominantly working with their cardiovascular fitness, not the heavy weight lifting as well.
Yep. Because they were doing it in stages. First, we wanted to see at rest, are there cardiovascular differences between early and late menopausal women? So early being 5 years after the onset at the most, late being 10 plus years after the onset of menopause. And there were definitely vascular changes from a molecular standpoint. And then we want to look at what can we do from a cardiovascular standpoint. And then the next one will be adding the resistance in. But if we look at other studies that are looking at resistance, we're seeing women who are in their 70s and 80s who are doing relative heavy to them, that they're, again, building lean mass in their 70s and 80s. They're getting better bone density, and it helps prevent the falls. So if they step off a curb wrong, they have better proprioception and can catch themselves. So then their fall risk decreases.
Wow. Which for our listeners, a fall is like basically the beginning of the end for a lot of elderly people. If you fall,
Yes,
because you can get a broken hip, you can get a broken bone, and then you're basically incapacitated in mobility.
yes, exactly.
Okay. So what we're seeing is from that cardiovascular, even if you're just working on the cardiovascular side, you're going to get benefits, and possibly even more, or likely even more, if we're adding weight resistance, weight training in there as well.
Exactly. And the big rock really is the resistance training. As much as women who are in their 40s and older hate to hear it, they're like, I don't want to go to the gym. I don't feel comfortable. Completely understood, because it's a very masculinized environment. But any kind of resistance training is better than none. Pilates doesn't count. That's more of motor control. And I know people do Pilates and they're like, oh, my core is so, it's strong. It's really tired. It's not the same. We're looking at doing repetition to failure with a load, not repetition to failure under body weight. Because again, that is the full skeleton. It's the full skeletal system, and it's that brain health.
I wonder if, as this information becomes more popularized and something like Pilates gets taken off the podium of like the best exercise you can be doing as a woman throughout your life, which it seems to have. I mean, it's all about you toning your abs, your booty building and all of those things. I wonder if we may create environments like specific gyms that really do tailor to this kind of training for women, and making it more accessible and more comfortable.
Yeah, we're seeing small pockets of like different CrossFit gyms. They're having menopause, and they're calling it Masters Women's classes, but it's geared towards teaching heavy loads. And then the Metcon part is real specific to sprint interval training. There are other functional fitness gyms that are doing the same thing. It's just small pockets. But I would like to see something like Lifetime Fitness or one of the massive big international gym chains take it over, or Equinox or someone like that, and be like, hey, we have these master women's classes, and we're going to teach you what it means to lift heavy safely. We're going to teach you these techniques. We're going to do functional movement. Pilates can come in the functionality when we're deloading. So it's not a wash, but it's not the be all end all. So yeah, that's kind of the dream.
Yeah, so interesting. And I have to say too that personally, I really enjoy doing 6 reps of heavy weights, because it's just that short output, and then you have a little rest, and it's done so quickly, and your whole body is like fatigued on the other side. It's not an hour of, running on a treadmill, which honestly bores me to tears.
Yes. And I was talking to a friend about this. She's an Ironman athlete, and she won Ironman world championships and stuff. And so she's 49 now, and she's asking how she should change her training. I'm like, resistance training. So we're teaching her things. And one of the conversations we got into was the difference in the fatigue between resistance training and endurance training. And I'm a longtime endurance athlete, so I've had to really switch and bring up my resistance training game. But with resistance training, you get that fatigue, but you also get like this total body feeling, because it's such a central nervous system response. And then your body responds with an output of parasympathetic. So you have the fatigued muscles, but you get more of this relaxation. You feel it an hour or two later. But when you're doing long endurance stuff, it's depleting, it raises cortisol, and it makes you tired, like really tired, not getting a boost of energy. So when we're looking at time and time management and energy levels, again, it's like, if you're a cardiovascular lover, then really do 20 minutes of resistance training and then some sprints, because you're going to get that feeling of endurance, but you're not going to get that cortisol and that deadened fatigue. You're going to get that parasympathetic feeling after that central nervous system heavy lifting.
Are you listening, everyone, about the calming effects of lifting heavy weights and sprinting? How amazing to have that as an option, and a very time efficient one, I must say. I learned this
Yes.
the hard way too, training for a marathon, or it was like a half marathon, but I was training and spent a number of weeks, and I just kept getting so fatigued and my body feeling so horrible. I was getting tension headaches as well, and I would just have to go to sleep. And I was just, it got to a point where I had to kind of pull out and say, look, there's something that my body doesn't want to do this. Even though
Yeah.
it's like this really popular activity that so many people do, my body didn't like it.
Which brings me to, if you've been training according to your menstrual cycle, it might not have happened.
Yes. Okay. Let's go into that now. We've covered the menopause stuff.
Yes.
Let's talk about when you're going through that menstrual cycle from,
What do we call it? The reproductive years? I don't know what the good like terminology is for it. Premenopausal,
your
normal.
menstruating cycling years.
Okay, we'll go with that.
Let's go with that.
Yeah. So, I've talked about how the period is an ergogenic aid, but when we look at the menstrual cycle itself and we see all the perturbations that the body goes through on a normal basis because of hormone shifts, we see a shift in thermoregulations or heat tolerance. We see a shift in our sleep patterns. We see a shift in our moods. We see a shift in our resilience to stress, and there's a significant changeover in our immune system. So when we're looking at the low hormone phase, so briefly, like day 1 is the first day of bleeding, day 14-ish is around ovulation, and then the high hormone phase is up to your next day 1. So in that low hormone phase, day 1 to 14-ish, our bodies are really able to take on stress and fight bacteria, fight virus, repair muscles, because the whole goal of having lower hormones is to create an environment that's really, really resilient to then producing a robust egg that's going to be fertilized. After ovulation, though, we don't want to fight sperm coming in from a biological sense. So our immune system changes not to fight invading bacteria, invading virus, invading weird kind of bugs, so to speak. We want to have a fever response. So if it's a parasite or it's a virus or a bacteria, it dies from heat. So we have a pro-inflammatory response from our immune system. So when we're looking at training, if we're doing a lot of high volume training when we're in that high hormone phase, we are producing a lot of inflammatory responses through our training. Plus, we have a pro-inflammatory response from our immune system. We have a higher baseline of inflammation. We reduce our adaptations because we need a little bit of inflammation for the body to read and overcome for adaptation. But if we have too much, then it just creates the systemic inflammation that creates like more fatigue, less repair, driving you more towards that overtraining syndrome. And then right when you get to mid-luteal phase, which is about 5 days before your period starts and those hormones start to drop, this is when we have a massive inflammatory response. And we have so many shifts of fluid, of fueling metrics. And when women are really trying to train hard and they're a few days out from their period and they're like, oh, I feel awful, I feel flat, but I'll keep going. They're countering their physiology when they should really be deloading and going, okay, let's deload, absorb all the hard training from the previous weeks so the body can really repair, it can regenerate. And so when I hit day 1 or day 2 again, I can hit it hard when the body's really resilient to stress.
So you're saying in the days leading up to our period, roughly 5 days, that's when, by deload, you mean rest, don't do anything? Or are there specific kinds of movement that we could be doing that help reduce or manage that inflammation? Do we need to be reducing that inflammation?
Some of it, yeah, to reduce any kind of premenstrual syndrome, also to reduce how heavy bleeding might be. So if we're looking at the whole menstrual cycle is based on an inflammatory response, if we reduce it slightly, then we have less severity of the actual bleed phase. When we're looking at that deload week, I know a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to take the whole week off. I have this scheduled. I'm going to this class. And it's like, it's not about taking it off. It's about modifying the movement. So this is where we're looking at yin yoga or Pilates, or we're looking at technique under the bar to really nail technique with lifting. We're looking at embarrassingly slow jogs, and we're not doing interval work. We're doing things that support our body and make us feel good, which a lot of us don't really allow when we're in this mode of go, 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 go. So if your soul food is to go for a long wandering walk, run, do it in the deload, because it's not going to be high intense. It's going to be food for your soul. So the deload is all about taking care of ourselves, making sure that our body is absorbing hard training and not being so hard on ourselves, knowing that, okay, in the next few days, when my period starts, my physiology is going to be like, yeah, okay, let's hit it hard. Granted, we have nuances within that. If someone has really bad cramps or heavy menstrual bleeding, but from a physiological perspective, that's when your body can take on that load again. So that deload is movement, but movement that supports recovery, not movement that's going to support breakdown.
Yes. And I think this is quite a counterintuitive or countercultural idea of what our bleeding time is all about. I know when I'm noticing my cycle, the time I really feel like switched off, like not functioning with life, like I don't want to take on everything, is before the bleed. And when it begins, it's like new fresh life floods into me, and I feel there is a perception that that's the time we need to be completely doing nothing and switched off, but you're saying our physiology says otherwise.
Exactly. And this is the thing, it's that cultural idea of, oh, you're bleeding, you have to be in the menstrual hut, or you're a delicate flower. Again, that comes from the male lens, because men don't bleed on a monthly basis. They don't understand it. And we have all the secrecy of, oh, it's that time of the month. And, you have tampon ads that are like, oh, be discreet. And so it's just this continuous messaging that we can't talk about, and we have to hide these things. But when we look from a realistic point of view, this is when the body is like, yes, I am strong and I can do anything. So bring it on.
Yeah, it is a really empowering time. I certainly experience it that way, but it depends how, as you said, like if we're dealing with heavy periods or cramping or lots of clotting and that kind of thing, it can be a different thing. What would you say for a woman going with, if she is feeling really exhausted, maybe on day one, maybe day two, those heavier days, depending, everyone's different with their sort of what it looks like, but would you say that it's okay to rest in that time?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, when I talk about like that high intensity work in menopause and having anti-inflammatory and antioxidative and a growth hormone response, we have that when we're premenopause too. So on really heavy days, it could be a couple of 20-second bursts up the stairs, right? You don't even have to change into your workout gear, but you do a couple of 20-second high intensity, and that's going to create a response that reduces inflammation. And this is going to feed forward for the next cycle, because your body is going to learn an anti-inflammatory response. Hey, I don't need as much inflammation. So we see it like with women who have heavy menstrual bleeding, and they get on an IUD, or they're using medication to reduce the heavy menstrual flow. They're still having cramps and stuff. So they do some high intensity work, and it starts to negate it. So we start seeing better outcomes for women who have really painful periods and cramping.
Stacey, I don't have time for 2 20-second stair sprints.
Oh, come on. Chase your dog.
I'm joking. How good is that? That we have
Yeah.
these things up our sleeve that don't really take much time at all. We all say we don't have enough time, but I think particularly what you're explaining here, and I love that it's so acute. It just gets to the result that we want, which is to feel better and to take care of our bodies better. And we can do that so efficiently, so quickly. How amazing.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about that sort of like time we should be deloading just before our periods, and then when we do start bleeding, if you're feeling that rush of like, okay, I'm feeling really powerful and good, that's the time you can get back into training and straight all the way through to ovulation.
Yeah. And with that estrogen surge that occurs right before ovulation, some women feel really fantastic and some people feel flat. But we want to take advantage of that surge where if you feel fantastic, go for those PRs, go for that high intensity class, go for that heavy lift, go for that hike that you've always been wanting to counter or attack, because the estrogen is our anabolic hormone. So our core temperature drops. So we have better heat tolerance, but we also have better metrics for muscle repair. We have better metrics for mojo. We feel more aggression. We have better neurotransmitters. And again, it's a fluctuating window because some women need that surge to happen and then drop off before they feel better. And some women feel better during the surge. So you want to take advantage of that window around ovulation. Then after ovulation, when we start to have the switchover of our fuel accessibility and our immune system, just bring it down a little bit. Do more steady state stuff. Do more moderate intensity work, not quite trying to hit those high intensities. You can still work on threshold like the 80%. You can still do heavier resistance work, but not trying to hit 90% of 1 rep max, but dropping more down to 70% and working technique and speed and power leading up to those few days before your period starts where you look to deload.
So it's really just following this wave of increasing intensity and then just dropping down slowly until you just rest through the month. I mean, that's how I visualize it. And I think that that can help simplify it in people's minds to think of it that way. You know, you can, you don't have to go super hard day 1 of your period, but yeah, if you're feeling it, go for it. But you could see it like a wave rising and then falling off on the other side. Now, you mentioned the importance in perimenopause and menopause of this weight training or resistance training and the sprint training as well. What would you say, is it the same thing for women who are cycling from that sort of like first phase of their cycle?
To hit it hard, doing heavy resistance work and high intensity work? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, instead of saying our typical thoughts around like things like Pilates or going for an hour-long run.
Now, put in your intensity work, put in your high resistance or your heavy resistance training, your higher intensity work, because your body can handle it. And we see so many better, I guess, post-exercise responses with regards to growth hormone, testosterone boosts, antioxidation, anti-inflammatory, better signaling for building lean mass. So you want to take advantage of that. And it's very time efficient, just like it is for peri and postmenopausal women. It becomes very time efficient. Like one of the sessions I did the other day is I went to a strength development class at a functional fitness gym. So it was like a full hour of 3 blocks of work and then finished off with 10 by 30-second sprints on the assault bike with a minute in between. So all in all, I was from door to door, from my house to the gym back in an hour and 10 minutes. So, it's time efficient. You didn't have to do the sprints at the end, but I really wanted to get that sprint interval in because I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it another day this week.
And you associate it with the positive benefits too, right? Which I'm sure would be very motivating.
Yes, absolutely. Because then you get better body composition change, which tends to be the aesthetic aspect, right? It reduces the signaling for that visceral abdominal fat gain. We know that resistance training for women has a different response with regards to fat burning than men. So when women do resistance training, we look and we see there's more mobilization of abdominal fat. So if women are afraid about putting abdominal fat on that comes with perimenopause, then doing resistance training is one of the best things that you can do for body recomp. We haven't even touched on the nutrition part, but protein, super important. There's a couple of studies that have come out looking at women who are normal weight, but over fat. So skinny fat, so to speak. And all they did was increase their protein intake to 1.6 grams per kilo. And they didn't do any exercise. And compared to the control group who just maintained their 0.8 grams per kilo protein, the women recomped completely over 12 weeks with just a higher protein intake. Wow. So it's like you want to look at what are we doing to support lean mass development and reducing that visceral fat. It's that sprint resistance training, super important, and protein. Those are the 3 big things for women of any age, but becomes really important as we get older.
And for someone who's like, okay, I like the sound of sprints, I've sort of maybe dabbled in that, but do we need to be following a specific program, or can we just is some better than nothing?
Yes, absolutely. Some is better than nothing. Ideally, you're having maybe 2 sprint sessions a week and you're having 3 heavy resistance loads. But you can back them up and have 2 in one day. So like I said, the other day when I did the strength development and the sprints, so that's 2 of my sessions done in an hour.
And when you say per week, you're not saying every single day of the month.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So doable.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
achievable. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. And the weight training, are we best to learn that with someone who can, like a personal trainer or someone who can guide us? Or do you feel again that we can just walk into a gym and sort of figure it out?
I'm at the adage that you want to learn how you move first. Like you don't want to add load until you have proper technique. Could be a physio first who looks at your mechanics and how you move and can tell you how to correct imbalances. And then you hire a personal trainer for 1 or 2 sessions to teach you how to back squat or teach you how to deadlift, to give you the cueing. And you want to make sure that you have really good technique before you add load. Some of my women take 6 weeks to 2 months to actually phase into lifting heavy because we don't want injury to come into play. We work a lot on mobilization, range of motion, looking at mechanics of how deep they can squat without hurting knees and hips and things. And we modify so that their body moves how it moves, and we add load with proper technique within their motions.
So no matter what life stage we're in, we all need to get on the weights and the sprints as women to be supporting our physiology long term. One question just popped into my mind with the menopause time. Is it like, do we just kind of keep going with that, the regular exercise week by week because we're not getting those same hormonal fluctuations?
Yep. And we know that it is more attuned to listening as well because we need a little bit more recovery. This is why we say like the minimum, you want this 3 resistance training and 2 high intensity days. And you might find that some weeks that you can really put them all in, and other weeks you're like, I'm so flat and tired, I can't. Because menopause is that interesting time where you have a lot of neurotransmitter changes, you're having a lot of body comp changes. So in the early postmenopause, it's really about listening and then putting the training in. You have the 80%, 20% rule that we talked about earlier. 80% of the time you're on it. And then the 20%, don't beat yourself up that you didn't get it done because your body is going through these changes.
Yeah, brilliant advice. Thank you so much, Stacey. It has just been amazing to chat with you and gather all this information and really clarity around working with our bodies and our hormone cycles, and our hormones, no matter what stage of life we're in, which is really nice to combine it all in one episode as well. Before I let you go, can you direct us? Where can people find you and learn more about your work and also your book?
Yes. So we are social media, Instagram and Facebook, if you still use Facebook, Dr. Stacy Sims. And then our website is drstacysims.com. So drstacysims.com. And that has a profile of all of our courses, all of our books, all the conferences I'm doing. It clicks onto all the peer review papers that I've done and the dissemination of science. So it's kind of like the big catch-all of everything.
Fabulous. I'm sure we'll all jump over to follow and keep up to date with the latest research and all this amazing stuff you're doing in your mission to support women's health and well-being. Thank you so much, Stacey.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
We'll have all that information in the show notes so everyone can go click through. And I look forward to having you back on the show sometime.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We have reached the end of this episode. If you enjoy this podcast and you find it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit subscribe or share this episode on your Instagram stories and make sure you tag @Georgie the naturopath. But that is all for today. Please be kind to yourselves. Know that you are enough and you are exactly where you need to be.